Iheanyi Ekechukwu. I'm a software engineer at IBM Watson Labs. So at work, we really, at least on my current project, we're using React, we've used Angular. But whenever it came to first starting to learn these MVC frameworks, I started learning Ember.JS because I'm going to be talking about how it made me fall in love with front-end web development. So a lot of you are probably wondering, what is Ember? Like, what's the hype around it? And whenever I first started, I didn't really know that much about Ember. Everybody was hyping up Backbone and Angular, and then React was just getting started. So I was really curious about Ember, and it had a lot of interesting ideas to it. Per their website, Ember is a framework for creating ambitious web applications. I've used Ember in about 4 projects and a couple more in progress right now, and I've just fallen in love with it more and more with each new project. So why did I choose Ember? Why didn't I use something like Angular or Backbone or React? I'm always asked this question, and I've always really given technical reasons, but for the purpose of today's talk, I'm just going to break it down why I like Ember as a developer, and also talk about its pros as a designer. So let's start with talking about why I like Ember as a designer. Using Ember, I can make ambitious user interfaces, like really ambitious. I started using Ember because I was taking interaction design in college, and I had to redesign the class searching experience for Notre Dame. And the UI I had mocked up was pretty complex and would have been a nightmare to implement with just only Ruby on Rails and JavaScript with some jQuery here and there. So I started researching a framework to take the load off of the development process, and Ember was looking like the best choice. So as you can see here, this is the picture of the UI in question. Like I said, I don't know how many of y'all do Rails on development, but creating this nested interface in Rails seemed like it would have been a nightmare. And I felt like Ember and its routing system made this UI pretty easy to create. So let's take a look at the final product. This isn't necessarily a one-to-one mapping to the mockup, but this is the end product. I was able to implement this design of the prototype, or the prototype of the design, excuse me, in about 8 hours. Ember saved me a lot of development time and really took a lot of the load off of developing this because of its routing system, which we'll discuss later, and some of its other aspects, which I'll also discuss. Now let's see another ambitious UI. Let's see, it's animating. Yep. So what's being shown here is a lightweight machine learning classifier, and this is built using Django in the back end and scikit-learn with Ember in the front end. And this is for my data mining final class project. It's a kind of completely different user experience, but it was just as painless to develop as a class search application. And I'm just going to let this finish running through. A lot to click around. So you're probably wondering, how does Ember make building these ambitious user interfaces so painless and straightforward? No, I'm just kidding. But like I've been saying, it's all thanks to Ember's router. With Ember's routing system, you have the concept of nested routes made really straightforward. And also, with Ember data, your UI, URLs, data, and state are all in sync with one another. And so here's an example router file for an Ember application. As you can see, the show or the detail view for contacts is nested under the contact root. And this is an example of how the root renders out. At the top level in the red, we have the application root, which all other roots are nested under. So that's like the topmost parent root. The context root is rendered into the application root's templates outlet, and that occurs whenever we're at the context root in the yellow. And then in the orange, you have the detail view, which is then rendered into the outlet of the list view to the right. So this is just that concept of nesting, and a similar approach was taken for the class search application for that 3-column view. And this is how, at the most basic level, how routing works in Ember. And also, I think as a designer, animations help take your user interface to the next level. As you saw in the class search application, there were some nice animations from view to view, and those were actually just handled with just pure CSS. It wasn't anything fancy. But sometimes you want to take your animations to the next level. So this is where Liquidfire comes in handy. What it is, it's an animation transition library by Edward Faulkner. And it makes it simple to create appealing yet engaging animations between the various routes within your Ember application. Let's see an example. As you can see here, there's a simple sliding motion between the various routes and views of the application. This is handled by Liquidfire. And you're probably thinking, wow, that must have been really complicated to get working. Well, let's see what's actually going on. So we're using Ember-CLI here to install the Liquidfire plugin. And in Ember, outlets are normally a way of telling your route where to render the relevant template for that route. So in Liquidfire, it changes a regular outlet into a liquid outlet, so it knows what part of the view to animate. Oh, snap. Actually, hold on one second. Bad, older version. All right, so then next, all you have to do is define a transitions.js file that tells Liquidfire what transitions to use between your routes. Then, and so as you can see here, we're saying from the index, use the to left animation by default, and then reverse whenever you're leaving it, use to right. It ships with default transitions such as to left, to right, to up, and to down, and then one called explode, which like increases the size or like really zooms in on various or common elements between views. But you can also write your custom animations if you so choose. And this was essentially my reaction after I got Liquidfire up and running, because it only took me about 5 or 10 minutes. It was kind of hard for me to believe that it was really simple to like add in animations between the routes like that. So that's kind of like some of the reasons why I like it as a designer. So let's talk about why I like Ember as a developer. So the core philosophy of Ember as a framework is convention over configuration. For those that do Ruby on Rails, this is a philosophy that probably resonates with you. And having just like finished learning Rails like a couple months back while learning Ember, this also really like connected with me. So by reducing the number of decisions that I had to make in terms of file organization, build system, et cetera, I was just able to hit the ground running and work on my projects and applications and not worry about having to get everything set up. And additionally, these strong conventions make it easy to look at any open source Ember application and know where the relevant business logic lies. And how many of y'all have ever used handlebars for templating in your front-end projects? See a good amount of hands. Well, if you've ever used handlebars before, then you'll be right at home with HTML bars in Ember. HTML bars is a variant of handlebars that builds up a DOM object rather than a string, but it's essentially the same syntactically with just some added niceties to it. Also, defining actions within your templates for Ember is pretty trivial. Let's take a look at an example for a sign-in action. So here's Page Unliker. It's an Ember application I built to unlike those embarrassing Facebook pages that bored high school Iheanyi decided to like. So right now we're going to focus on the Facebook sign-in button in the top right. Let's see how we'd implement this login action with some help from Ember and Ember Simple Auth. So on this button, we've given it the sign-in action for whenever it's clicked. So next, we need to tell the controller what to do with this action. So in this controller, we are defining our sign-in action to authenticate the user using Facebook Connect when the sign-in button is clicked. And then after a successful authentication, we want to transition to the likes route, and you're done. Pretty simple. Going further, you can also pass in objects to actions, such as an instance of a model, in order to perform actions on said objects, like maybe deleting or updating or editing. And like you saw in the code, this is the likes route that you transition to after a successful authentication, which then displays all of my liked Facebook pages. As you can see, High School Iheanyi was well aware that he is alive and not dead. But let's talk about data models such as likes and how Ember data kind of plays into that. So Ember data is a library for storing and managing the state of your data in your Ember app. It comes with a variety of adapters to choose from, such as a REST adapter, JSON API adapter, and active model adapter. But there are also like third-party adapters for use with other backends. So for example, there's one I've used with Django called like the Django adapter that I found on GitHub, and it just helps. By using Ember data, you don't really have to struggle that much with managing the state of your data. It just handles all of that for you and removes most of the difficulty around that. So let's kind of see a quick example of Ember data in action. So first, we're going to use Ember-CLI to generate an adapter to be used by our entire application. This is kind of like the second time I've shown an Ember-CLI command, but I'm going to address that later on in the talk. And now with this REST adapter generated, we can configure it to send every single AJAX request to the API namespace in the root. This can be further configured with other options such as host names. So this is really helpful for if you separate your backend and your front end. So you can just set that to api.example.com if you so choose. Next, we want to generate our contact model and its respective attributes. And then here's the output from the generate command in our model/contact.js file. Now we want to generate a route displaying all of our contacts. All right, now that's over and done with, but how does our route know what data corresponds to the model at this route? Through adding the model function, and it's called a store.findContact, our Ember application will send an HTTP request to API/contacts to fetch every single contact, serialize it, and then store it client-side, which can then be accessed from our templates. So this cuts down on a significant amount of boilerplate. No more having to write AJAX calls or and then handling all of the success or the failures. And then also you can have the state of your data just handled by the Ember Data's data store. And if you want to make a GET request for a single contact, no problem. All you have to do is pass in the ID or other primary key attribute for the API in addition to the model name, and you're good to go. Similarly, you can define the data for the contact, such as their first name, last name, email, etc., and then make a call to store.createRecord in order to send off a post request and create it server-side. And setting server-side queries isn't that difficult either. All you have to do is define a JSON object with the query parameters that you want, shoot off a call with store.query to the backend, and what that'll do is just send a GET request with the relevant query params and return those queried results back to the client side. And with access to a previously retrieved model, by changing an attribute on the model and then saving it, this will then send off a put request to update the model server-side. Now, calling delete record on the model will delete it from the client-side store. But if you use this function here, you'll have to make a subsequent call to contact.save to persist this server-side. Think of this as a soft delete. So this is helpful for when you want to do something like confirm that they want to actually delete the user or delete another resource. But if you don't want to do that, just make a call to contact.destroy record, and this will delete it both from the client-side store, but then also fire off a delete request to your backend as well. So through these examples, you can see how Ember data helps reduce repetitive code that you always have to write out, like especially like AJAX calls and AJAX functions. And it's just like clean abstraction of just the various AJAX functions. But I'm going to talk about another feature that I really find myself using often in my applications. Computed properties. Sometimes you need to have computed properties or properties that are dependent on like one another or other properties on your model. So let's see an example of this. So here we have the computed property of full name computed off of the first name and the last name property. And then you can use the computed property just like any other property, which makes life easy. And the cool thing is, if I were to change the first name property, like which is currently Iheanyi, to my full name, Iheanyi Ekechukwu, then the full name property would change to Iheanyi Ekechukwu, so they're in sync with one another. And additionally, you get some helper functions such as sort that simplify making some computed properties pretty straightforward. Other helper functions include greater than, less than, difference, union, and others from like set theory. And then a lot of frameworks have this. I kind of like how Ember does the binding of attributes. It comes in handy for, I use these often whenever I'm using image URLs, like in my data mining project, and just setting URL sources for like download links. So I'm just going to show a simple example for our mail-to link. And we know that our models all have an email, so we can just call this attribute within our HTML element, and everything is all good. And this is like probably the most basic example I could have thought of, but simple mail-to link. So whenever you have parts of your application that are going to be used in multiple areas, it's good to just throw it into a component. Additionally, you can wrap third-party JS plugins into Ember components as well and use them from inside of there. In the future, components will completely replace controllers once they have routing built in. So they highly recommend trying to use components as much as you can in your current Ember applications to make the transition more smooth in the future. So I'm just going to show an example of like a quick component for a contact card. And all you have to do is just say Ember generate component contact card. Let's just say that the contact card component is the full name and description. And then here is how you'd use that component. And what that will do is render out the contact's name and description wherever you use that. In this example, I was under the assumption that the model would be equivalent to one fetched instance of a contact, but we could use the same component in a for loop through looping over an array of contacts and just passing every single contact into that component, and it would render similarly just a list of like full names and descriptions for every single contact. But yeah, kind of, let's take a break from the technical talk of things, and I want to talk about something that's really, important for developers and novices. I think in software development, especially for new people, communities are really important. That said, the Ember community is really awesome and welcoming. Say hi to Tomster. This is the official mascot for EmberJS. He kind of has a lot of uniforms. This is actually Tomster's Dallas uniform, I believe. I actually met most of my developer friends in Austin because of the Ember community. Shout out to the front side. The community has been so helpful. I've asked questions on Twitter, IRC, and Slack, and I've always gotten people eager to help me out, and some even offered to pair program with me over Skype, even though we've never met or talked before, just for me to figure out what's wrong or like to improve upon my code base. And I think that's really, as a novice, like entering the community, that was really like heartwarming to experience and to be a part of. And you probably have enough Slack channels already. I think I have like 14, but one more won't hurt. And so I highly suggest joining the Ember community Slack channel, even if you are just like starting out. There's lots of amazing people in there, and I know we'd love to have you. I think that tooling is also another area in which Ember shines. I was really impressed for what I found for Ember between Ember Inspector and Ember-CLI, and I'd say that's probably like between the major libraries, it's the most, like, it's the best out of all of them. Even Angular 2.0 CLI is actually just forked from Ember-CLI, so it's pretty awesome. And Ember Inspector is Ember's debugging tool, available as an extension in your browser or bookmarklet. It's helpful for seeing the state of your model data, controllers, and other useful data, such as your roots, deprecations, promises, and like how long they took to resolve or eject, dependency injections, and rendering performance. Here's a small screen cap of Ember Inspector, more specifically focused on the data. As you can see in the view on the right, we're able to get information on the has many and belongs to relationships on these contact models if they do exist. And I didn't have an example for this in this screenshot, but if there was that relationship of belongs to and that model was being shown in that right pane of the Ember Inspector, you could click it, and what it will do is transition the plugin to that relevant model and change it up. And actually, did you know that Heroku was actually an Ember application? I actually wanted to show a view of like Heroku's roots internally, just because it was richer in information than my simple contact application. But other examples of Ember applications that you can go and look at are Twitch, let's see, Stripe, and Apple Music, also on desktop or Mac. So that's pretty cool. So now I want to talk about Ember-CLI. I already gave like a brief introduction to it earlier, but I think I want to go into more detail on the internals of it and its functionality. So what's the hype? So one thing I really noticed, that I really liked about Ember-CLI is that I was able to start using ES6 or ECMAScript 6, which is the next version of JavaScript. Before they were using Esperanto. I think they're migrating to Babel now. But this translation of your ES6 to JavaScript made it nice to build Ember applications because, to be honest, I hated writing JavaScript until ES6 just because it was like a headache. But ES6 really makes for a pleasurable JavaScript development experience. And your vegetables are important, especially broccoli. Broccoli is an asset pipeline / build system for front-end web applications. The beautiful thing about broccoli as a build system is that it only rebuilds the parts of your application that have actually changed. So as your application gets larger, you won't see a major performance hit to your build times. And this is really important, especially working on large applications, right? Because as your project scales up, you don't want to be losing time to compiling or building of your application. And it's like, yo, that's cool and all, but what about Bootstrap or preprocessors like Sass? And I'm glad you asked. So let me talk about third-party libraries now. So let's use Bower to install Bootstrap like we do in any old project. And then this is the Ember-CLI build file. And all we have to do is import the Bootstrap file or CSS file into this, and you're done. Under the hood, what Broccoli does is takes its third-party dependency and any other ones that are listed in there, and it compiles them all into a vendor.css file, which is automatically added into your Ember application. And what about for JavaScript libraries? Yep, this is looking pretty familiar. And you just import the JavaScript file like you did to the CSS. And this, most of the time, works out well. I mean, some people write wrappers for Ember-CLI for these third-party libraries, but often you're good enough doing just Bower install and importing it into it. And so yeah, it's works out best for AMD-compatible libraries. But for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. And now you should have access to a global moment object in your Ember application, so you can call it from any file, and you'll be OK. And this is getting added into a vendor.js file that's also imported into your Ember application. And for preprocessors like SAS, just run ember install Ember-CLI SAS, rename your app.css file to app.scss, and that's it. No further assembly required, and all this pain has been taken out of getting this configured. Thanks, Hove. So let's talk about how Ember allows for better productivity and collaboration amongst developers. So I know I'm terrible at puns, but do you remember those conventions? We were talking about convention over configuration earlier. So by using Ember-CLI, it makes it easier to collaborate with your team with one really nice feature of Ember: generators. These are really nothing new. You have generators in Ruby on Rails. You have similar concept in CLI tools like Yeoman. But I really like how Ember has these generators because it just works out, because like you literally have this generate command for generation of roots, models, and essentially every little thing in Ember has a generator to it. And what this does is reduce the amount of code that you have to write. Well, let me backtrack. It not only reduces the amount of code that you have to write, but it also takes the guesswork out of placement of these files. By placing these files in their proper location, taking out that guesswork, I can go to the open source Ember projects and be like, oh, look at this view, or look at this root. Okay, I'm at like the games root. So let me go to the games controller/games and see what they're doing here. And so it just allows for people to like really study other people's projects and collaborate and contribute. And working on a large team, that's really helpful because you don't have to worry about like arguing over how you're going to start this project, how are we going to like store or organize our controllers and our templates. You just say, well, CLI does this all for you, so that's the way we're going to do it. And let's see here. And now I think add-ons are really important for like any ecosystem, but the ecosystem for Ember is actually pretty darn good. Ember Observer is pretty much my go-to site for when I need to find a specific add-on. There's also emberaddons.com. What I like about Ember Observer is that it organizes the add-ons into categories relevant to their functionality. With over 1,000 add-ons, I haven't had any trouble finding an add-on for a specific need yet. And like, I'm not joking whenever I say this, there's probably an add-on for almost everything. I'm going to show the two most common examples that people need in like pretty much every project. Need user authentication in your application? Just use Ember Simple Auth. This makes handling your sessions really easy on the client side of things, in addition to like simplifying user authentication and authorization in general. Through its adapter pattern, I've had no problem using Simple Auth with Devise and Rails, or just authenticating using Facebook Connect, as I showed earlier. So they make it easy and extensible to create your own custom adapters for the library that you can then upload to GitHub and share with others that may need it as well. And that's a very common pattern that you see with Ember, between Ember Data and also Ember Simple Auth. And what about if you want to build out your front end, but your back-end developer isn't done yet? Sometimes you want to have a mock API service to use for writing the test for your front end in combination with everything else until your back-end API is completely fleshed out. And I just discovered Ember-CLI Mirage recently, but for my brief usage of it, it's been pretty impressive and pretty fun to use. So here we define our factory. If you remember the contact model that we generated earlier, it's perfectly symmetrical to that, and I'm just defining it with fake data. And now this is where we define our API endpoints. For brevity, I'm just going to do a GET request for every single one and then a single contact resource. And here we're saying that we want to create 10 contacts, and then we're done. You can change this number to anything that you want, and you can also like tweak things up a little bit with foreign keys as well. And then we want fetch these contacts in their relevant root. And then, of course, we want to display them by looping through them. As you can see, you got some computed property action going on up there. And then here's the final product of the UI. Pretty simple and pretty handy for like mocking out your data. I always say that testing is important and you should do it for the kids or for the developer after you. That said, I kind of had nightmares writing front-end tests without a framework, but Ember and Ember-CLI makes testing really painless, and for the few times that I've done it on like my personal projects, it's been really fun and enjoyable. By default, Ember ships with QUnit for running its tests, but let's see an example of how we test our context route. First, you want to generate an acceptance test, TDD style. And here we are setting up the acceptance test. In the actual testing block, we're creating the mock values with Ember-CLI Mirage, and then visiting the context route to make sure there are contexts displayed properly in the front end. And it has a lot of cruft that goes with it, but as you can see, you navigate to the test route in the URL in your Ember app, and what it will do is show you all of your tests running in the browser and the results from it. And if you like Mocha, like me, it's easy to get started using it. Once again, you have the handy Ember install command for Ember-CLI Mocha. And here's a similar structure of the code before, just using Mocha's syntax. And then what it does is it runs the test in the browser once again at that test route, and you can see the results and the execution time of all of your tests. But what if you want to run your test from the command line, or how does the test get run in continuous integration in like Travis CI or Circle CI or Jenkins? Just use the Ember test command, and if you like to have things watching, well, my bad, getting ahead of myself. What this does, it runs the test, and it tells you the outcome of the results. And then if you want to continually run your test as you're constantly changing your files, you can just run the Ember test with server, and it'll just watch for changes and reload the test or re-execute the test on file change. And I think one thing that a lot of people have struggled with is like deploying these actual applications or these front-end applications, whether it's Angular, Ember, Backbone. And it's become even a little bit more trivial whenever you have your front end and your back end separate. But if you keep your back end, front end application separate, like I do, I kind of like using Ember-CLI deploy. Well, I do like using Ember-CLI deploy for this because once again, it's a highly extensible library, and through its adapter pattern, I'm able to deploy to the platform of my choice. There are adapters that exist for deploying to Azure, using Redis, and even deploying to Amazon S3. All you gotta do is install Ember-CLI deploy in addition to the adapter of your choice, and of course, configure it. And then you run the Ember deploy with the environment attribute of production, and you're good to go. So before, this slide used to be div shop, but literally 3 days ago, they were just acquired by the Firebase team at Google. So now I'm gonna talk about Firebase. For deploying to a static hosting service like Firebase, it's pretty similar to Ember-CLI deploy. And this is just an example of the website. First, you want to install Firebase tools globally. Next, you want to configure the project for deployment in the root directory. And then we just deploy using this command, and you're done. And it'll send back to you a URL where you can then view your Ember project in the browser. And what if you're trying to deploy to a platform as a service, such as Heroku or IBM Bluemix? There's a build pack for that. Here's a command that you'd run for Heroku. And here's a command that you would run for Bluemix via Cloud Foundry. All of these deployment methods are running the Ember build command prior to pushing the code to or uploading the code to the service of your choice. And what this does, it gives you the benefit of minification and fingerprinting of the assets, once again, allowing you for greater productivity because you don't have to worry about having to debug like caching or like, cache errors on the front end or performance errors or like having to do all that yourself. Ember-CLI just does that for you out of the box. And getting started with Ember-CLI is easy enough. First, you install it globally. And then you create a new project. And now you're ready to dive in with all the new information gained today. Have fun. All right. Thank y'all.